is on fire. Sebastian, put that chair flat. There you go. So raise your hand if you can hear me. So the Enlightenment is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I think it's one of those things where we can all understand, I hope, and you understand this naturally. Nobody has to, wow. Nobody had to teach you about the Enlightenment for you to internalize, which means to basically make part of how you think the lessons and the thoughts of the Enlightenment. Let me try to find a good example. I got to find somebody who's going to actually participate. Yeah, you learn it just like any other first language. And I'm going to try to demonstrate this to you right now. All right, this is a scenario. Okay, that won't work. You just do it? Okay. Who should I? Okay. Jake, do you mind if I go through your bag? What's that? No, you don't mind? You don't mind at all? Okay. Why did everybody laugh when I asked him that? Diana.
Normally you're not allowed to go through someone's stuff.
Why not? Okay. So what? Privacy? Why? I don't think so. I don't think you deserve. I mean, if I don't suspect Jake of anything, but if I did, why can't I just search his bag and find out if he did it? Why do I need a warrant? I don't have enough authority. Let's hear from Melissa. Okay. So let me hear from Jenna. Ah. So are you saying I'm not fair to Jake?
No, I'm just saying, like, per se, like, you say if you did it, like, you could just, like, assume something and then, like, make it into a bigger deal. You don't really have evidence.
But even if I don't like him, if he did something, you know, if I find something that he did something wrong, shouldn't we punish him? Okay. So here's the Enlightenment idea that you've all internalized. You all laughed when I asked Jake to search his bag. You don't necessarily know, and I wouldn't even be able to tell you what types of laws. Well, let's see. Can anybody name the place where it's sort of set down that that I don't have the right to search Jake's bag without a good reason? Chris? Okay, the moral compass, but so what? I have no moral compass, and I don't subscribe to your morality. What prevents me in this setting from doing that? What's that? Okay, I need permission and warrant, but why? What backs up the concept that I don't have the right to search his bag legally? Okay, it's his property, but so what? So notice, nobody knows where that is. Hold up now. You're right. Nobody knows where it's written down that I can't search Jake's bag. But indeed it is. It's called the Fourth Amendment. It's the part of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution and protects citizens from what we call unlawful searches and seizures. It means that, of course, someone could search Jake's bag, but as everyone mentioned in here, there's a... I'm okay if they're just listening for right now, actually. But someone needs good reason. There's a process for establishing that good reason. And there needs to be reasonable suspicion. And by the way, Jenna pointed out that the fairness of the person who conducts the search is very important. The person, you know, just let's say Mr. White doesn't like Jake, which isn't true, but Mr. White just wants to get Jake. That's not an appropriate reason to search his bag. That's an Enlightenment ideal. And you go through it without even thinking about it. You live in a society where we base ideas off of what we call the European Enlightenment. So let's take a look at that today. All right, so this was sparked by the scientific revolution. What the scientific revolution opened up to people was the idea that the universe was understandable, comprehensible. And they started to apply that idea to people, okay? If you went back to medieval times, the understanding of people would have been, oh, they're all just kind of bad, and they probably need, you know, they need kings to govern them, because God will establish the kings, and with God's leadership for the kings, people, you know, that's how we get good societies. But people ultimately, you know, just do crazy things. We can't understand them. That idea is going to start to change. The questions about government. People will begin to, just as this happened and always happens in the United States, people question the purpose of government, what government should be doing for people. That's what we'll look at. So the scientific revolution spurs into this. And because in the scientific revolution you found ways that you could examine the world, you found that you could start to examine people in the way that they act too. All right, we had Newton. We'll talk a little bit about John Locke, not the character from Lost. But the idea was you could use science to understand the world and create progress in it. The word of the day became reason. Now, again, this is important to understand. This is happening for like the top people, the smartest and the richest in society. This reason thing isn't necessarily getting down to the regular person on the street. But they thought if you used science, if you used reason, rationality, logic to improve the world, that would be a good thing. This is going to be known as the Enlightenment. Okay, so Isaac Newton, we saw how he used ideas about gravitation, this idea of gravity, that the world was almost built like a machine. This is how Newton would have thought of it. The world was kind of like a machine, that if you could open it up and examine how it's worked inside, you could figure out lots of different things about how the world worked, and that people could understand it. You know, when it comes to questions now, there's more and more that we believe science can answer, although there's some things that people still think science can't answer. So he almost thought in some ways, or people began to think, you could almost understand people or the way like people act in the same way. Here's John Locke, for instance. John Locke believed that people, okay, we talk about why do people end up the way that they are? Why do you end up, you know, 15 years, 16 years, 17 years, the person who you are with your own sets of things that you like and don't like, and ways that you think and ways that you act? How does this happen? Old answers would have said, well, people are born, part of one could be people are born naturally sinful, so they act bad. People just have a sort of nature that they're born with, that's just who they are. John Locke had another idea, and he felt that people were basically ultimately born as what he called a blank slate, and people were shaped by what they experienced. So if you wanted to look at why a person was the way that they were, you had to look at the things that had made their experience. For instance, so we know this is backed by science today. People, for instance, that you know, are touched by violence in some way become somewhat more likely to commit violence themselves. People that are treated with respect and dignity, often, not always, will treat others with respect and dignity. So people thought you could actually structure society using science. All right, the philosophes, they were like philosophers, but many of them, these guys were French, and they took a lot of Enlightenment ideas and took them further, wrote about them, discussed them. Most of them drew their ideas from English thinkers, but they were French. And this Enlightenment takes place over the course of a century, and people are going to develop these ideas. Let's talk about some of them. Okay, Montesquieu was a guy who thought about government. We all care about, even if we don't care about politics or the government of the United States, if you're not into that, you still care very much that things are understandable. You know, when things go, for instance, teachers. If you have a teacher who's arbitrary and just gives grades based on what they think you should have and plays favorites, we have a sense that that is incorrect. You know, what rules govern this classroom? And so Montesquieu wanted to think about what the purpose of government was. And Montesquieu basically thought, as many of these Enlightenment thinkers are going to say, that the purpose of government is to serve the people, not the other way around. They went back to, Montesquieu would do this, Locke and Hobbes, who we'll talk about in a second, would go back to the time before there was government. They thought back to, okay, what would it have been like before government? What would it be like if there were only, 2 people in the world. Some of them would say, hey, even with that, those 2 people have to come up with rules. They can figure them out themselves. What happens when it gets bigger? What happens when it becomes 30 people or 300 people? How do you develop those rules? Montesquieu thought ultimately government should be have checks and balances. He would look at the way that kings could, make decisions one day and change them the next day. And he said, this isn't good for people. So what we should do is make government in 3 separate branches. These are the branches that you see in our government. They took pages right out of Montesquieu in order to form the U.S. government. There was a lawmaking body, people that made the laws, a legislative body. There was an executive body. Their job was to carry out the laws, but they don't make them. A lot of people get the impression that a president can simply go in and make laws. Now, there's places where the president can make what are called executive orders, but those are not laws. Then you have the judicial system, which interprets the laws and then applies them based on a set of principles. So that's our government now. Who else you got? You got Voltaire. Voltaire did a lot with talking about religious tolerance. What he would come back to was basically the idea that ultimately, when people were talking about religious truth, and and there's still goes on today, my religion's correct and yours is incorrect, and all that kind of stuff. Voltaire would have said that really, ultimately, nobody knows. I mean, you can say, well, I know because of this and that, and that's all great, but other people are equally as convinced their religion's right too. So Voltaire said the best thing for a government to do, really, is to allow people to worship as they please and ultimately stay out of government. Voltaire was a deist, and what he believed basically was that God had created the universe. He had sort of set it in motion, and then from there, everything sort of unfolded based on natural laws, that God didn't really intervene in things. God didn't work miracles necessarily. So that was him. Then there was Diderot. He wrote the encyclopedia. This was not like an encyclopedia like you think of it or anything like Wikipedia. But what he did was he began to collect knowledge into one larger volume to try to make it accessible to people. William Penn was the founder of Pennsylvania, basically. He began to support the idea of pacifism. And the pacifist idea grows out of the concept that people ultimately, when left to their own devices, will be peaceful. And also, William Penn was a Quaker. And the Quaker sort of believes that the Quakers are Christians, but they believe that people ultimately have a sort of divine spark in them. And to kill someone is to take that away and is to transgress against God. Okay. Then you had the physiocrats. They were French thinkers. They wanted to figure out how economics work. This eventually gets to a guy called Adam Smith. Here's a great example. How many of you have someone in your family who owns a small business? Okay. And how many of you find that the people that own the small business, some care very much about how much the government affects their business? Like how much taxes they take or what the government says they can and can't do? Yeah. Okay. Well, you'll see that a lot. Adam Smith, basically, his idea behind what an economy should do. How should we determine, how to buy and sell things? He ultimately believed that the best way to do it was to allow people and individuals to make decisions. This was called laissez-faire capitalism. Leave it to itself. Government should really stay out of the economy and let people decide their own affairs with it. And this capitalist system is what we basically operate on today. Okay, this is Worthington.
With the exception, I don't know if anyone, if I may just interject and add a current event, see if any of the kids have heard, maybe you know more about it. Recently, I heard on the news they're trying to go to Pennsylvania. What do we all like to drink?
The soda tax. Yeah.
People are, this is like all over social media. So do you know a little bit more than I do?
There have been different states and cities that have tried to pass soda taxes. This is just in line with, and Smith would have something to say about this, I think. Also in line with, say, liquor or cigarette taxes. The thing is that, to liquor and cigarette, that seems more like, yeah.
It's going to impact everybody.
Right.
Your Chuck E. Cheese age kids to the teenagers.
Right.
So
and Smith would say ultimately, I think what he would have said, although he didn't encounter that type of consumer economy, was that people would make their own good decisions. Maybe not for themselves, but for the economy, they would make good decisions. So, but yeah, so that's one example where Smith would say the government should really stay out of that. Others would say that you could use the understanding of what it does to try to shape policy. Okay, how about justice? We talked about Caesar Beccaria, less severe punishments. And so what's going on here? You have to remember, when I talk about all that drawing and quartering and things like that, the reason that they used very, very harsh punishments in a lot of these societies was because there's really no police to speak of. There's no group of people that are civilians that go out and basically do a lot to even solve problems before they become crimes. That's not in place. So the only way to really discourage people is to just simply round them up after they've committed the crime, give them a swift and severe punishment, and hope it keeps other people from wanting to commit those crimes. But Cesare Beccaria basically said we need to find a way to move towards more enlightened ways of punishing people and of rehabilitating them. Anybody ever been to the Eastern State Penitentiary? No? Go. Because you can go and see how ideas about punishment changed over time. The earliest part of the penitentiary, which was built in like the late 1700s, the idea was that and this is how people's ideas change for the better a lot of times, was they used to put people in individual cells and isolate them, because the idea was that if this person was isolated and given a Bible and a space to be, they would ultimately begin to pray and reflect and feel bad about their sin and ultimately come back to behaving well. Of course, isolating prisoners also has a huge effect on their mental capacity, and they start to isolation is not good for people, and so that was bad on the other hand. So that's what they got going on. Okay, Rousseau was an Enlightenment thinker. He thought all these guys are kind of going with reason and logic. Rousseau thought you needed to balance all that with human emotion. He believed in what was called the social contract. And the social contract basically boiled down to a lot of ideas people had, was that people basically give up certain rights in order to have other rights protected. Here's a great example. We all accept in here, even if people have done it, even if it's happened, that you shouldn't steal things. Do people steal? Of course. But there's pretty much nobody in the world that thinks, unless they're a sociopath, that thinks that stealing is okay for everybody to do. It just doesn't happen, because societies that say, yeah, it's fine if you steal whatever, those societies end up violent and people steal each other's stuff and they don't survive. So what happens is that Randall, for instance, accepts that he shouldn't steal Haley's stuff, and the idea is that ultimately that protects our own property. So we give up the right that we think we may have to steal other people's stuff in order to have our own stuff protected. That's the social contract. Okay, how about the rights of women? Hey, unfortunately, we can't say a lot about what's going on for women in this time. As enlightened as it may have been, all sorts of great ideas. For women, there were not women getting the right to vote and things like that. In fact, most men didn't even have in fact, the idea of a vote is even sort of crazy to some people at this time. So, but female thinkers did begin to express their opinion. Mary Wollstonecraft was seen as the founder of the modern European and American women's rights movements. She argued, and other people argued against her, that since the Enlightenment was about reason, and women had reason, they were basically the equals of men. There were lots of Enlightenment thinkers who were willing to argue that anybody with reason was basically equal. There were ones that even went so far ahead of their time as saying that skin color didn't matter at all as long as someone had reason. There were a lot of people that didn't catch on to that yet. But they weren't often willing to go the next step and say that reason applied to women as well. Some of them said, well, women are very emotional and they can't think straight, and that kind of thinking is carried up even to the present day in some cases. Okay, what about the Enlightenment? So basically, these ideas spread around a lot slower than you might think. This was mostly the upper and middle classes of people. And the Enlightenment thrived on people basically getting together in either coffee shops or their own homes and discussing a lot of these ideas, reading things and then kind of batting ideas around. And that was going on. Okay, let me see how many slides are. I'm going to pour it. Okay, great. All right, Hobbes and Locke. Locke and Hobbes. These guys are very important to understand because they both had different theories of government. Okay, the text is a little small here, so don't worry if you can't read it. I'll try to give you the basic idea behind Hobbes. So what Hobbes would say is, let's talk about how we work a classroom. What Hobbes would say, if I was like the ruler and you were like the subjects, all right, if this was like a larger government, what Hobbes would say is ultimately to keep a classroom or a people in order, they needed to have someone very, very strong to keep it in place. He argued that absolute monarchy was the best form of government because all the power could be concentrated in that one person and they could use it to better their society. So people needed strong leadership, direct leadership. They needed a person who would basically tell them what to do, most of them. He thought that if you didn't have this, if you didn't have someone keeping order, then life was ultimately, he said, solitary, meaning alone, poor, which he means bad, not necessarily like economically poor, nasty, brutish, which means like animalistic, and short. So he said, without someone strong keeping order, people can't live good lives and productive lives. He said people don't have any right to revolt against the king or queen because people ultimately give up, like that social contract, their rights in order to have others protected. Okay, Locke's going to go the other way, whereas Hobbes would say that if you showed up on, February 28th for this semester, if you showed up on February 28th and I sat over in the corner and Mrs. Worthington with me and we said, hey, listen, guys, you're here to learn some world history. Go ahead and learn it, and we'll be here to just kind of keep an eye on it and everything, just whatever. Hobbes would say that place is going to be out of control at some point. He'd say the same about a government. The government says, well, you guys could just sort of decide. Poor leadership, that's going to get messy. Locke went the other way. Locke has a completely different view from what Hobbes said. They agreed on a lot of things, but what they disagreed on was how people naturally acted. Hobbes thought that if I wanted to take something from Randall, there's lots of ways I could do it. Now, Randall's pretty young. He looks pretty strong, so maybe I physically couldn't take Randall on by myself. But maybe, on the other hand, there's somebody I could physically intimidate and take their stuff. Maybe somebody like Matt. I don't know. But maybe not. Maybe instead I decide to get people together. I decide to get Randall. Hey, listen, we're gonna take Matt's stuff. We'll divide it up, okay? And we're gonna get Shanna too. We're gonna team up against Matt. We're gonna steal his stuff. Hobbes says that's what people naturally do. They either use their own power or team up together to exploit somebody else, and that's why you need laws. Locke thought the other way. Locke thought that actually we would, if left to our own devices, people would actually act appropriately. People were naturally reasonable and moral. He also believed that they had a right to life, liberty, and property. You feel that need, that right to your property. You all laughed when I talked about going through Jake's stuff, offending his privacy, his liberty, really. We all giggle when we made the illustration of if Randall just started stealing stuff from people. We all believe in that. And most societies do in some way, shape, or form. And Locke really thought that ultimately if government became destructive of that, let's say, for instance, if I as a teacher began to take away your rights in ways that harmed you, then you had the right to sort of overthrow that. These get tied up in the Declaration of Independence. These are ones they have you quote in third grade, and you just don't know what they mean. But hopefully you're coming to understand them a little bit. So here's Jefferson. We hold these truths, the truths of what they call the Declaration of Independence, to be self-evident. It means that you don't need any evidence to prove them. They're just obviously true. It's something that anybody can understand. That all men, sticky one here, they meant all white men at the time of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson had some ideas maybe that would change. Complicated, very complicated. That all men are created equal. That they are endowed or given by their creator with certain unalienable, which means you can't take them away. You with me, Jake? Rights. And so then he named them. And this was the founding of the government, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They had property in there, and they took it out because pursuit of happiness sounded better than property in a lot of ways, and it broadened it too. So whenever you face that, and one thing I encourage all students to do is to understand their rights as students. In a lot of cases, you don't always know what they are because people don't always tell you what they are, but you have them, and they are there. And they're founded, ultimately, upon Enlightenment principles. Cool. Those were long notes. Everybody did a really good job. Way to hang in there. Let's take how many questions are there? Ooh, okay. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take 7 minutes to make sure we can get them all right. And if you need to take a walk around, pause and drink water,